He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I started to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and for this week's episode, I wanted to explore some of the more weirder disappearances of the past and some of the most inexplicable circumstances. And while I've tiptoed on the odd areas that are subject to a plethora of missing people, what about areas that are subject to missing everyone? And again, not only areas, but ships too. We're going to be getting into some of those as well in today's episode. So in most cases, whether or not these are extraterrestrial or interdimensionally related, or just subject to earthly circumstances that remain to be seen, let's talk about our first complete vanishing case. Now, Lake Anjikuni. There's a village mystery here that refers to an alleged mass disappearance of the entire settlement in 1930. According to the story, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle visited the village and found it completely abandoned. The houses were all empty, the villagers nowhere to be seen. The only clue to their disappearance was the fact that all of their belongings, including food and clothing, had been left behind. Joe LaBelle found unfinished shirts that still had needles in them and food hanging over fire pits, and came to the ultimate conclusion that the villagers had left suddenly. Even more disturbing, he claims to have found 7 sled dogs dead from starvation and a grave that had been dug up. Now, LaBelle suspected that a wild animal couldn't have been the culprit or responsible for this because the stones circling the grave were undisturbed. He reported this to the Northwest Mounted Police, who they conducted their own search for the missing people, to which no one was ever found. The story now has been embellished over time, as most situations are, with some versions claiming that strange lights were actually seen in the sky before the disappearance. One of the most common claims is that disease or famine struck the village. But I ask you, if that actually be the case, where were all the bodies? Reprints of this claim have been published many times. However, one shortly after the event, written by journalist Emmett E. Kelleher, stated that Joe LaBelle had found the camp containing only 6 tents, and it was a total of 25 men, women, and children that all went missing. So much more specific than what was initially reported. Now, as for the area, Anjikuni Lake is up in northern Canada, Nunavut. It's one of the many lakes located along the Kazan River, and its shore is mostly noted for its rocky outcroppings and is subject to many barren ground caribou that migrate through the area. The lake itself contains trout, northern pike, and Arctic graylings. Now, in conclusion on this mystery, the RCMP has officially dismissed this case as being nothing more than an urban legend. Okay, seems fair. Claiming it originated in a book written by a Frank Edwards, as well as the fact that being a more rather large village like this, it could not have actually sustained itself residing in a more remote area, along with no records of any unusual activity in this area. No flack towards the RCMP. I formally apologize, but I refuse to accept the phrasing. And I quote, "Such a large village would never have been possible in such a remote area," end quote. We're discovering species that exist in places where no life should. Humans are exceptionally adaptable in their environments, but there is part of my wording, this weird white man society complex that people can't live or sustain themselves remotely or outside of a small city town scape. Again, my own perspective. But people are capable of living in the most remote places of the world and living off of the most minute things. And it blows my mind that we tell ourselves that that's not allowed. It's almost like there's this, again, this white man society complex where, you need to live in the cities. You need to live in the skyscraper, close within city limits and all whatnot. A lot more people are pushing for the countryside and living out far away from the towns, even myself. So I'm not saying I'm living in this kind of life, but take it with a grain of salt. Just because they say people can't live in an area doesn't mean that maybe they haven't before. If that makes sense. I digress. There was a man named Brian Dunning. He's an American writer and producer with a focus on science and skepticism. He managed to actually find actual evidence of Emmett's article that was published back in 1930. Now, to me, this debunks the notion that the story originated in the 1959 Edwards book like the RCMP had claimed. So in closing, I do believe that there was definitely something going on with this settlement. Now, I mentioned prior that there were reports of lights, and it's hard to know if this is really embellishment on the story or whatnot, but again, who would have seen these lights? Was it our main character here that stumbled upon and found that everyone was missing? Or did LaBelle just happen to hear that from someone else, or was it embellished? There's so many different ways that we can look at this, but I definitely would associate higher chances of seeing UFOs back in the day when you don't have planes, you don't have anything else really flying around in the sky, no satellites. So you're going to be seeing a lot more of these things. Just my own take. Moving on to our next case, the Reneke Island Colony disappearance. This case starts now with our man, John White. He was the governor, and he had to leave this colony 9 days after the birth of his granddaughter, Virginia Dare. And her name is very important because she is the first English child born in North America. Now, John White's departure was, again, not for vacation or anything. This was for a very important supply run to England in the year 1588. The colony was established in 1585 by Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, due to this colony suffering from delays of supplies from England, also suffering from hostile relations with nearby indigenous communities, this trip by John White was imperative. Eventually, he would return 2 to 3 years later. Now, many tribulations and setbacks occurred, and he really was trying to get back home. And when he finally returned, all the settlers had vanished. We're talking about roughly 100 men, women, and children all vanished. Due to bad weather pouring in, John White was unfortunately not able to conduct a very thorough search. He had to cancel it and return to England. Now again, like the previous case of missing people, conventional thinking has steered many to suspect the people died of disease or starvation, or perhaps annihilated by nearby indigenous people, or on a lighter note, simply moved away. One thing White did discover was a word carved into a post near the abandoned settlement, Croatoan. Now, this has served as a long-standing assumption that the residents departed for Croatoan Island, but has not been proven fact. Ultimately, to this day, still, extensive efforts have unfolded to solve this mystery, but it, however, remains a mystery still. And in closing for this, there's a fun fact regarding Reneke Island. Through archaeological excavations back in the 1980s, it was discovered to be the site of ancient indigenous settlements dating back to 8,000 years before Christ. And it acted as a prominent fishing village 1,500 years before English settlers arrived. So in closing, archaeologists actually were able to study tree ring data from the area and determined that there was extreme droughts that took place in this rough time period. However, we really don't know what happened to the colony. It's just still a mystery to this day. As for John White, he died 3 years later after returning home and seeing that everyone had gone. I also think it's worth mentioning that the rich level of history, 8,000 years worth of humans residing in this area, that is astounding. And in my personal opinion, where you have a very long-standing amount of human history, you are more prone to not necessarily paranormal, or hauntings, I should say, but more interesting, heightened activity of a sort. So maybe that is the case here. Maybe it was something paranormal. Again, I do not have factual evidence to back it up, aside from the fact that people disappeared and we still to this day do not know why. But without further ado, we're going to jump to our first ad break and we'll be right back. And we're back. Now, of course, like I alluded to at the beginning of this episode, these mass missing disappearances aren't only limited to villages. Enter Exhibit A, the Mary Celeste. So this was a ship that was found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean on December 4th, 1872. The ship was discovered by the crew of the De Gracia, a Canadian brigantine, who were surprised to actually find the Mary Celeste abandoned. There were no signs of struggle or foul play. The ship's cargo and supplies were all still intact, and the crew's personal belongings were still on board. However, the crew, nowhere to be found. The Mary Celeste had actually set sail from New York City on November 7th, 1872. With a cargo of denatured alcohol bound for Genoa, Italy, the ship was commanded by Captain Benjamin Briggs, and his wife and daughter were also on board, along with a crew of around 8 men. The disappearances of the crew of the Mary Celeste has, again, still remained a mystery for well over a century. It's usually the number one go-to, I would say, if you were to tune into missing disappearances and ghost ships. It's the Mary Celeste just appears there. Now, some theories have come out to try to explain what happened. And in these theories, they suggest the crew may have just abandoned the ship due to fears of an explosion caused by the volatile cargo of the denatured alcohol, while others propose that the crew may have just fallen victim to piracy or mutiny. But again, the cargo and everything was still there along with their personal belongings, so that can't be right if it was piracy. And if it was mutiny, why would the crew not take any of these things, make away with the spoils? So there's no conclusive evidence to support any of these theories, of course. And the disappearances of the crew of the Mary Celeste, again, it still remains one of the most enduring maritime mysteries of all time. Now, this is just the first instance, and one of the more popular cases, like I mentioned, of ship missing crew that's under mysterious circumstances. But these cases pile up quickly. For another example, the High Aim 6 was a Taiwanese fishing vessel that left the Lichu port in southern Taiwan on October 31st of 2002. It was then discovered without its crew, drifting in the waters off Australia on the 8th of January 2003. The actual owner of the ship was actually able to have made contact with the ship's captain in December of 2002, so this was still about a month before. The vessel was registered also in Taiwan, flew under an Indonesian flag. The disappearance of the High Aim 6 is just one of several cases of Taiwanese fishing boats that are disappearing in the Pacific Ocean in recent years. Now, some of these incidents have been attributed to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which is a major problem in the region. However, the specific cause of High Aim 6's disappearance remains a mystery. And lastly, I have the case of the ghost ship Jenny. However, it is important to note that this story is unverified, and there is no concrete evidence to support the fact that this incident has ever occurred. The story of the ghost ship Jenny is often cited as an example of a maritime legend, and it has been retold and embellished over the years, as these stories tend to be. Well, there are some reports of ships becoming trapped in the ice of the Drake Passage. There is no record of a schooner called the Jenny being discovered in this region, or of any ship found with a crew frozen to death. That being said, the stories of this ghost ship and other strange happenings seem to be part of like the lore that is cementing in. And again, while the ocean can be a dangerous and predictable place, sailors have long told tales of these ghost ships, sea cryptids, and other eerie phenomena, including USOs and UFOs. Now, of course, pirates are certainly a culprit in many of these cases, but it does leave the door open nonetheless on the possibility of that unknown factor occurring. I defer to USOs and UFOs. Both land and sea alike, I believe that there are powerful access points. While I have no factual evidence to back up such claims, this is purely my perspective. I defer to the notion of Skinwalker Ranch, Reuben and I did a thorough deep dive into this, and in short, this place is believed to serve as a gateway to some place well beyond our understanding. People have reported seeing actual lighted areas open up out of thin air. Now, this is well beyond our understanding, but these thin-aired opening up gateways, so to speak, and that's probably a very blunt way of putting it, have these unidentified visualizations creeping out of these openings. And of course, the opposite exists on this as well. I defer to quantum mechanics and how Bigfoot can shift in and out between our realm of existence and its own. Then, of course, missing children and hikers out in the woods, covering massive distances in short time spans, or just completely vanishing without a logical understanding as to why. We can also examine how floating orbs of light and old tales claim that the purpose and motive of these mysterious phenomena are to lure people off the safety of the trail, only to never be seen again. Whether that's into another realm, who knows? Could simply be just a very remote part of the woods that search and rescue just can't find you at. I almost forgot one more thing, and this gained traction more recently, and I don't attribute it to being one of those TikTok trend videos either. You got to be very careful when you're going through the TikToks. There's a lot of mumbo jumbo in there, and people just looking to get the next high, so limit yourself. I digress. The stairs in the woods. Now, we covered this topic on a previous episode of Cryptid Clues, and all in all, I don't plan to go anywhere near them should I find some in a national park. I found a few articles of park rangers being told to ignore them specifically should they stumble upon them while they're out and about. And other claims of people actually seeing, again, unknown openings associated with these stairs. So you have these points in national parks. You have a point like Skinwalker Ranch. I fully do not doubt the fact that maybe there are other points that have opened up. You have areas that are popular and have human history dating back 8,000 years. Maybe there is a supernatural cause or relation to that, and maybe it could be just some powerful gateway. When you look at a globe and we kind of map things out like the 49th parallel, and we just kind of highlight certain parts of the globe, it's interesting to note that we highlight them for ourselves. Who's to say that they aren't highlighted for something else as well? I don't mean like slyly and kept hidden out in plain sight for the public and society to see. I mean in the sense that maybe these other entities or visualizations of sorts have a similar map system like we do, where they can access and come through certain gateways. Now, of course, like I mentioned with Bigfoot and the whole accessing the quantum realm and what they're capable of, whether or not they were to use gateways or it's simply just a on-command ability, I do not know. But it just is interesting how these sort of blend together, and you have cryptids and you have areas where people can go missing, and then powerful channeled areas where people see open manifestations just come out and visualizations come in and go in and vice. Like it starts to mesh over. And I think that's interesting. I really, really do. But I digress. With a lot of North America have been semi-explored up to this point, it's very different than how settlers back in the day would come out here with a small party and establish themselves as a small community. Many perils of nearby, of course, but the dangers of a whole city just up and disappearing, that doesn't happen today. Not a chance. Now, unless we evacuate or natural disaster is inbound, we have no real modern-day mass disappearances in today's society. There is, and I did an episode on this, the situation of airplanes, which is very interesting. Go check that out. There's a documentary that Netflix just did as well, A Missing Airplane, with 239 people on board. I believe it was the Malaysian Airlines flight specifically. But again, not large cities, not current day settlements or small communities. So what is really going on? It makes me wonder if it's some sinister government plot. Again, take this with a grain of salt, totally my perspective and just hypothetical statement here. Is it a government plot? We keep just building up in our cities and stay away from the woods because these gateways are out there, and as long as we keep people together and the safety and sanctuary of our cities, we don't have to worry. Whatever's going on out there will stay far away from the metal of man, you could say, so to speak. But who really knows? All you can do is really just be careful. stay on the tracks and try not to get lost out there. So, in closing, was all of this just a case of the times? Disease, famine, storms, high seas, just marketed then and published to write off this unknown mystery? Or was this just genuine intervention by some unknown component that eludes us? Again, there have been reports, and make sure you do your research, because there are reports that have been very well debunked. Aliens coming into towns, mass abductions and stuff like that. Same thing with boats, UAPs, USOs. The list goes on. But that's all for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed the case of the disappearances. I will be back next week along with Reuben. We are planning an in-depth look at the recently booming topic of ChatGPT. Now, this is a very, very rapidly accelerating new notion into the world. And there is a interesting religious connection that it has. And Reuben and I are going to be exploring a little bit more of that next week's episode. So until then, you can find us at CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as our Patreon, where you can get ad-free episodes. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe. Thank you.